Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 339, The Role of Women in the Russian Revolutions of 1905 and 1917, Part 1. Last time, we covered the effect of the Bolshevik Revolution on the Russian people. Today, in the first part of a two-part series, we will cover the enormous role that women played in the revolutions. My sources for today's podcast include Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, WorldHistory.com, and in particular the article, quote, 12 Key Women in Revolutionary Russia by Mark Cartwright, and Lenin, the Man, the Dictator, and the Master of Terror by Victor Sebestyen. While men take much of the glory for the revolution, like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and the rest, without women, the Bolshevik Revolution and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II might never have happened. What struck me in my research was the level of education of many of the women who witnessed the injustices of the Russian Tsarist system against the people. Their belief that things needed to change and their willingness to sacrifice themselves are truly admirable. Before we can discuss the role of women in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, we need to go back to 1905, the first Russian Revolution. Women were at the forefront of the protests against the Tsarist regime, which they felt had failed to address the economic depression gripping the country. Women were active and central participants in the 1905 Russian Revolution. They led numerous strikes across the country. Many became political organizers, led large protests, and their activism was central to igniting the revolution. They were involved as factory workers, peasant women, and intellectuals who agitated for social change, organized into political groups, and even helped persuade soldiers to join the protesters. Their participation was diverse, ranging from liberal feminists advocating equal rights to radical workers who took to the streets to demand change, demonstrating the wide-ranging impact of women across different social strata. Here are some of the key roles women played in the 1905 revolution. As I mentioned, women were at the forefront of strikes. For example, over 11,000 women textile workers went on strike in a town near Moscow in June 1905. Amid the many strikes and protests, women took to the streets, agitating to persuade soldiers not to fire on demonstrators and to instead join the revolution. A significant number of women participated in radical movements, including as assassins and in other acts of direct action. I will be talking about some of the more famous ones. Liberal women formed organizations like the All-Russian Union for Women's Equality, which fought for political and voting rights and had 8,000 members and 78 branches in 1906. Peasant women also became politicized, rioting against landowners and fighting Cossacks with their bare hands and farm tools. Women also represented in the newly formed workers' councils or Soviets. In some cases, like at the Kachnitsa factory, more women than men were elected to the Soviet. Women writers and journalists helped to raise political consciousness about women's issues and the broader social and political injustices in the Russian Empire. Mark Cartwright lists 12 women he felt played significant roles in both the 1905 and 1917 Russian revolutions. Now I'm going to add a few more, but the ones that we're going to talk about include Catherine Breshkovsky, Ekaterina Breshkovskaya, Anna Shabanova, Vera Figner, Maria Pokrovskaya, Zenaida Ivanova, Ekaterina Kuskova, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Aridna Tirkova, Alexandra Kollontai, Inessa Armand, Maria Spiridonova, and Maria Bochkareva. My list includes the following women: Vera Karolina, Maria Nikiforova, Larissa Reisner, Vera Zazulich, and my favorite, and I think the most important, the working women of Petrograd. I'm going to start with this last group, the working women of Petrograd. February 23rd, 1917, Old Calendar, or March 8th, Gregorian Calendar, was International Women's Day, and it was marked by a general strike by women working in the textile industry. It would spark citywide protests under the banner of bread and peace. The protesters demanded an end to World War I, an end to bread shortages, and the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. You absolutely cannot overstate the importance of these protests, carried out mainly by women. They persuaded soldiers to return to their barracks and to not support the Tsarist government. This would be one of the main reasons, along with the shutdown of westbound trains, that Nicholas would be forced to resign 7 days later. Without the brave women of Petrograd, the 1917 revolution may not even ever have occurred. Leon Trotsky had this to say about the protests. Quote, February 23rd was International Women's Day, and meetings and actions were foreseen. But we did not imagine that this Women's Day would inaugurate the revolution. Revolutionary actions were foreseen, but without a date. But in the morning, despite the orders to the contrary, textile workers left their work in several factories and sent delegates to ask for the support of the strike, which led to the mass strike. All went out into the streets. The provisional government was established, and one of its earliest declarations was granting women the right to vote. This would predate the United States passage of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote in the USA. International Women's Day was adopted by the Bolsheviks in 1921 as a day to honor women who began their protests. It wouldn't be until 1965, though, that the Soviet Union made March 8th a non-working holiday. The day was more than that. It was, as the decree stated, it was, quote, in honor of the outstanding achievements of the Soviet women in building communism, defending the motherland during the Great Patriotic War, their heroism and selflessness both at the front and at home, and for their great contribution to the strengthening of friendship among peoples and to the struggle for peace. Our first woman we will talk about, and whose name, excuse me if I mispronounce it, but it's a really tough one, is Ekaterina Konstantinovna Breshkovskaya. Born on January 25th, 1844, in Ivanova, Russia, Catherine, as she is commonly known, was born into a serf-owning noble family. She claimed in letters and correspondence from her book, The Little Grandmother of the Russian Revolution, Reminiscences and Letters of Catherine Breshkovsky, that her father, Konstantin Verego, treated the serfs well. Breshkovsky was seen as a significant figure in the Russian socialist movement, a Narodnik, a movement of Russian intelligentsia in the 1860s and 1870s, some of whom became involved in revolutionary agitation against Tsarism. She would later become one of the founders of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Catherine has been described as Russia's first female political prisoner, where she would be either in exile or in prison for almost 4 decades. In 1868, Catherine would marry Nikolai Petrovich Breshkovsky and have a son with him, but she would abandon the marriage and move to Kiev, where she would join her sister Olga and fellow revolutionary Maria Kolenkina in a commune that followed the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. In 1874, Catherine gave birth to a son, Nikolai, but she abandoned him to be raised by relatives. Catherine would not meet him again until he was 22. He became a writer of thriller novels and would emigrate to Poland, then France, where he would become a Nazi sympathizer writing for the pro-Nazi Novaya Slovo, a newspaper for white Russian immigrants. Nikolai would die in 1943 in Berlin during a British bombing run. Catherine and her cohorts would produce false passports to travel around Russia and stir up revolutionary fervor. This would lead to her arrest and subsequent trial in what was known as the Trial of the 193. This was held between 1877 and 1878 under the rule of Tsar Alexander II. It was the largest trial to date of revolutionaries held in St. Petersburg. Catherine, along with a number of the defendants, would act defiantly, verbally abusing the judges. The trial has been described as highly mismanaged, which led to several defendants being found not guilty, some of whom would join the Narodnaya Volya, the organization that planned and carried out the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, including Sofia Perovskaya and Andrei Zhelyabov. Breshkovsky would be sentenced to 5 years in a katorga, a system of penal labor in the Russian Empire, and later be the basis for the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. Catherine would be the first woman to ever be sentenced to the katorga. Released in 1896, Breshkovsky would struggle to rejoin the younger generation of radicals, but she was able to develop a following that helped her create the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 1901. 3 years later, she began a tour of the United States to raise awareness and funds for her causes. She would return to Russia in 1905, just in time for the revolution, but would be arrested in 1908 and sentenced to life in Siberia. She attempted to escape in 1913, but at the age of 69, she was recaptured just a short distance out of town. When the provisional government came to power in 1917, one of its first edicts was the release of Breshkovsky. She would back their claim to power, which put her at odds with the Bolsheviks, leading to her leaving the country for Paris. Then, in 1924, to Czechoslovakia, where she would pass away in 1934. Nobel Prize winner Ivan Bunin recalls hearing a conversation amongst some peasants about her. It went something like this, quote, "She's a soothsayer, that's for sure. The word on her is that she's been predicting all these goings on for the past 50 years. But God help us, she's really beastly looking. Fat, angry, with very small penetrating eyes. I once saw her portrait in a feuilleton. She was chained in a stockade for 42 years, but they couldn't break her. She was never left alone, day or night, but they couldn't break her back. Even in the stockade, she managed to get a hold of 1,000,000 rubles. Now she's buying people for support, promising to give them land and not to draft them for war." Our next famous female revolutionary is Anna Shabanova. Born in 1848 in Smolensk to a wealthy landowner, she would become one of the first female doctors in Russia. Disillusioned by the second-class treatment of women in her country, she would be arrested for the first time when she was just 16 years old, while protesting for women's rights, spending 6 months in prison. Because there were no spots in medical school for women in Russia, she began her medical education in Helsinki, Finland, returning to Russia in 1873, when they finally offered courses for women. Shabanova would graduate in 1878 and start her career as a pediatrician 5 years later. Over the years, she would champion the cause of improved women's rights as a highly respected physician and socially conscious woman. Shabanova was one of the founders of the Russian Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society, and during the 1905 revolution, campaigned for women's suffrage while being critical of Tsar Nicholas II and the entire idea of autocracy. She believed that everyone should have the right to vote and wanted the government to allow total freedom of expression, putting an end to any form of censorship. Shabanova would survive the Russian Revolution and would continue to practice medicine for most of her life until her death in 1932 in Leningrad. Up next is a big name in the revolutionary movement, Vera Nikolaevna Figner. Born on July 7, 1852, she was the daughter of a wealthy member of the hereditary Russian nobility. Vera's maternal grandfather owned large estates with numerous serfs. Still, her family did not think highly of her when she was younger, as they thought of her as, quote, a beautiful doll, good to look at, but empty. Little did they know that she would become an important revolutionary, implicated in the successful plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander II. Her family sent Vera to the Rodionovsky Institute for Noble Girls in Kazan in 1863, when she was only 11. It was a school meant to teach young women to be subservient, which caused the young girl to rebel, although silently. Vera would read banned books surreptitiously to avoid certain public punishment. Despite all that, she was considered an excellent student, earning the top student award when she graduated in 1869. Early on, Vera wanted to become a doctor, but after the closure of the only medical school in Russia that admitted women in 1860, she had to head to Zurich, Switzerland for her education. She would study at the Department of Medicine at the University of Zurich beginning in 1872. The following year, Figner would join the Fritsky Circle, which was composed of 13 young Russian radical women, some of whom would become important members of the All-Russian Social Revolutionary Organization. It is here that she would radicalize herself, feeling guilty for being from such a well-off family. An order was issued in 1873 that all of the women studying medicine in Zurich were to return immediately, as absurd accusations were made that they were illegally performing abortions on others and on themselves. Now, Figner refused and remained for 2 more years. In 1875, Mark Nathanson, founder of the Circle of Tchaikovsky, Land and Liberty, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party and a Russian militant, begged Vera to return to Russia as the Fritsky women needed her. Upon returning, Figner was appalled by the poverty she saw, especially in contrast to Zurich. Now, this is something that when the Russian soldiers came back from the war against Napoleon, and they came to their country and saw how desperately poor the Russian peasants were, far worse off than European peasants, many of them became radicalized, even more so than they were before. Now, she would berate fellow socialists for their insistence on discussing how society should take care of the peasants rather than actually doing something. Her anger was also focused on the Tsar and his regime. Vera believed that nothing would ever change until the Tsar and his cronies were dealt with through the use of terrorism. She would join the Zemlya i Volya, Land and Liberty organization. Numerous radical intellectuals belonged to this group. Some believed in nonviolent means of change, whereas others, like Figner, believed that only through violence could anything be accomplished. By 1879, the group needed to split up, with one side being led by Georgy Plekhanov. His group was called Cherny Peredel, or Black Repartition, and included Pavel Axelrod, Lev Dich, and Vera Zazulich, among others. The other side was a pro-terror faction called Narodnaya Volya, or People's Will, which Vera joined. She would be a member of the executive committee, which in 1879 called for the execution of Tsar Alexander II for crimes against humanity. Vera would help plan an assassination attempt in 1880, which failed. Her group would then prepare for the successful operation that killed the Tsar on March 1st, 1881. Figner knew that the police were onto the group, and in particular, her, so she went on the run. For the next 2 years, she evaded capture until she was betrayed by fellow Narodnaya Volya Executive Committee member Sergei Degayev. This would begin the next 20 years of her life in prison, although her original sentence from her trial in 1884 would be death. While her sentence was commuted, instead of being sent to Siberia, she would be sent to the fortress at Schlüsselburg until Vera was sent into internal exile first, into the Arkhangelsk Gubernaria, then to Kazan, and finally to Nizhny Novgorod. In 1906, Figner traveled abroad, speaking at rallies throughout Europe, raising money for numerous causes. Vera would return to Russia in 1915 and become a supporter of the Bolsheviks in 1917. Her book, published in 1920, Memoirs of a Revolutionary, would tell her story of imprisonment as well as those of the others who worked with her. She would spend her last years writing several other works, including Penal Servitude, 1927, which expanded on her time in prison, followed by After Penal Servitude, 1930, in which she reflected on her life after release. In 1932, she wrote From the Recent Past, and in 1933, she published Recollections, offering personal reflections on life and the struggles of being a revolutionary. Vera Figner would die at the age of 89 on June 15, 1942, in Moscow. Our last two women of note we will cover today are Maria Pokrovskaya and Zinaida Ivanova. Maria Pokrovskaya was born in 1852, and again, she was an educated teacher and doctor. She worked primarily with the poor in St. Petersburg. What I found interesting in reading about her was that she was trying to end state-run prostitution. Delving deeper into the subject, I found out that while not entirely state-run, prostitution in Tsarist Russia was regulated as being under, quote, medical police supervision. Women also had to register and receive a yellow ticket, subjecting them to state control and confining them to specific neighborhoods and types of housing. Maria worked to end this, which inspired her to start a feminist journal known as Zhensky Vestnik, or Women's Messenger, in 1904. Pokrovskaya founded the Women's Progressive Party in 1905, but what happened to her after the Bolshevik Revolution is unknown, but it is likely she was killed during the Red Terror, as she was a critic of the Bolsheviks. Lastly, Zinaida Ivanova, writing under the pen name Mirovich, was born in 1865 near Smolensk. Little is known of her early life, but she became a translator of foreign works, including the writings of Henrik Ibsen and John Stuart Mill. Ivanova was one of the founders of the All-Russian Union for Women's Equality during the Russian Revolution of 1905 and joined the All-Russian League for Women's Equality. She would continue to write about women's rights in Russia until she passed away in 1913 in a town outside of Moscow. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we finish the series on the role of women in the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. Now, I'm hoping to have this done in 2 weeks, but I'm having a total knee replacement next week, and we'll see where I'm at medically and physically at the time, but I think I should be able to get this recorded in time for that. So, until then, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.